There was a winter in my life when I stopped speaking. Not entirely, of course. I still saw my patients. I still ate dinner with my family. I still answered the letters that arrived at Küsnacht in their leather satchels. But something inside me had withdrawn. Something had folded itself inward, the way certain flowers close at dusk, not in death, but in preparation. I remember sitting by the lake at Bollingen, watching the water hold the grey sky like a mirror that had forgotten how to flatter. And I understood, perhaps for the first time, that the loudest thing a soul could ever do was to fall silent. The world had been speaking through me for so long, opinions, expectations, the chorus of voices I had inherited without permission, that I had forgotten the sound of my own depths. And when I finally stopped, when I finally let the noise drain out of me like water from a cracked vessel, something extraordinary began to happen. The pieces of my life, which I had spent decades trying to arrange by force, began to move on their own, not toward me, not away from me, but into their right places, as though they had been waiting all along for me to stop interfering. This is what I want to speak to you about tonight. Not as a doctor speaks to a patient, but as one traveler speaks to another in the long hours before dawn. I want to speak about silence, not the silence of avoidance, not the silence of suppression, but the silence of return. The silence in which a man finally hears himself. And I want to speak about what happens when you stop pouring yourself outward and begin instead to descend. You have been told, I suspect, that life is something you must seize, that you must speak louder, push harder, declare your presence in every room. The modern world worships motion. It mistrusts stillness, the way ancient villages mistrusted the man who lived alone at the edge of the forest. And so you have learned to perform, to explain, to defend, to convince. You have learned to fill every silence as though silence itself were a wound. But I tell you, and I have seen this in the faces of 1,000 patients over half a century, the wound is not the silence. The wound is the noise you have been using to cover it. What mythology has been trying to tell us for centuries is hidden precisely in the figures who chose withdrawal. Think of the prophet in the desert, of the Buddha beneath the Bodhi tree, of Odin hanging upon the world tree for 9 nights without food or speech. Think of Persephone descending into the underworld, of Christ in the wilderness, of the alchemists locked away in their towers, tending the slow fires of transformation. None of these figures grew through outward striving. They grew through descent. They grew through what the alchemists called nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution, the necessary night before the dawn. And in every one of these myths, the same secret repeats itself like a heartbeat, that the soul does not flourish in noise. The soul flourishes in the dark, alchemical silence where it can finally hear what it has been trying to whisper to itself for years. I once treated a man, I will not name him, for the dead deserve their privacy, who had built an empire of words. He spoke to crowds, he wrote books, he counseled politicians, he was admired across 2 continents, and yet he came to me one autumn, shaking, because he could no longer sleep. When I asked him what tormented him, he could not answer. He had so many words for everyone else that he had none left for himself. His persona, that masked the world, had pressed upon his face until it grew into the bone, had consumed the man beneath, and the man beneath was starving. I asked him to do something terrifying. I asked him to spend 1 month in near total silence, to stop explaining himself, to stop performing, to sit each morning by a window and simply listen to what arose within him. He resisted, of course. The persona always resists, because the persona believes that to fall silent is to die. But what the persona calls death, the self calls birth. Here begins the darkest game of the unconscious. When you finally stop speaking outward, the inner voices grow louder. And not all of them are pleasant. You will meet first the part of yourself you have spent your entire life avoiding. The shadow, the figure that walks behind you in dreams. The one who carries everything you have refused to admit you are. Your envy, your cruelty, your desire, your cowardice, your hunger, your rage. The shadow does not appear when you are busy. The shadow appears in the quiet. This is why so many people fill their lives with noise, not because they love the noise, but because they fear what the silence would show them. And yet, I tell you, the shadow is not your enemy. The shadow is a part of you that has been waiting in exile for you to come home and claim it. To integrate the shadow is to recover the energy you have been spending all your life to suppress it. The man who knows his own darkness is no longer ruled by it. The man who refuses to know it is ruled by nothing else. But the most surprising part is yet to come. Because when you have sat long enough with your own darkness, when you have let it speak, let it weep, let it rage, and finally let it rest, something else begins to emerge. Beneath the shadow, beneath the wounded child, beneath the noise of the ego with its endless demands, there is a deeper figure waiting. The alchemists called it the lapis, the philosopher's stone. I called it the self. It is the totality of who you are, the divine pattern that has been weaving itself through every chapter of your life, even the ones you would rather forget. And the self cannot be reached through speech. It cannot be reached through striving. It can only be reached through descent, through silence, through the patient, terrifying willingness to sit in your own depths until they reveal themselves. I have observed something curious in my patients over the years. The ones who try to fix their lives by acting outward, by changing jobs, changing partners, changing cities, changing everything except themselves, they often return to me a year later with the same suffering, wearing a different costume. But the ones who turned inward, who learned to sit with themselves the way a mother sits with a fevered child, neither fleeing nor forcing, these were the ones whose lives slowly and almost imperceptibly began to transform. Not because they had pushed harder, but because they had stopped pushing. They had stopped trying to drag the river in a direction it did not wish to flow. And the river, freed of their interference, found its own course toward the sea. This is what I mean when I say that focusing on yourself and remaining silent allows everything to fall into place. I do not mean that you become passive. I do not mean that you abandon the world. I mean something far more radical. I mean that you stop trying to control what was never yours to control. You stop performing for an audience that has already moved on. You stop arguing with people whose minds will not change. You stop explaining your soul to those who lack the eyes to see it. And in that withdrawal, that holy, deliberate withdrawal, you discover something the noise had been hiding from you, that the universe responds to the man who knows himself in ways it never responds to the man who is still searching for himself in the opinions of others. The detail most people overlook hides precisely here. They believe that silence is an absence, an empty room, a closed mouth, a kind of nothing. But silence, properly understood, is the most active thing a soul can do. Silence is the crucible in which the raw material of your life is transformed. The alchemists knew this. They walked in sealed vessels because they understood that transformation requires containment. What you broadcast, you lose. What you contain, you transmute. And the modern man who broadcasts everything, his pain, his opinions, his every fleeting emotion into the great electronic void, has lost the ancient art of containment. He wonders why nothing ripens within him. He has been opening the vessel every 5 minutes to check on the work. He has not let the fire do its slow, sacred labor. I think often of the old story of the king who lost his kingdom because he could not stop speaking. He spoke in council, he spoke in court, he spoke in his sleep. He gave his counsel to anyone who would listen and many who would not. And in time his words lost their weight. They became as common as rain. When at last he had something true to say, no one believed him, because he had spent the currency of his speech on 1,000 things that did not matter. This is the modern condition. We have spent the currency of our attention, our words, our presence, on 1,000,000 small noises. And so when our soul finally has something to whisper to us, we cannot hear it. We have lost the instrument with which to listen. Modern man has lost his gods, but not his need for them. He has lost his temples, but not his hunger for sacred ground. He has lost his rituals of silence, the morning prayer, the evening contemplation, the long walk in the woods. but he has not lost the soul that those rituals were designed to nourish. And so the soul, unfed, begins to cry out in other ways. Through anxiety, through depression, through that strange hollow exhaustion that so many of you carry without knowing its name. The cure is not another distraction. The cure is not another stimulant. The cure is the descent. The cure is the silence. The cure is the willingness to sit alone with what you have been running from. What Jung said about this is deeply unsettling, and I will say it again now in this room to you. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. You will believe that the world keeps doing this to you, that people keep treating you this way, that circumstances keep arranging themselves against you, but the pattern is not outside you. The pattern is the unlived part of yourself, projecting itself onto the world like a magic lantern throwing images upon a wall. And the only way to dissolve the projection is to turn slowly, painfully, courageously, and face the source, which is always in the end yourself. I want to tell you about a dream a woman once brought me. She dreamed that she was wandering through a great empty house, calling out for someone, she did not know whom. Room after room was empty. Her voice echoed back to her, hollow and frightened. At last, she came to a door at the end of a long corridor, and behind that door she heard weeping. She opened it. Inside sat a small girl, perhaps 7 years old. With her face in her hands, the woman knelt down. "Who are you?" she asked. The child looked up, and her eyes were the woman's own. "I have been waiting for you," the child said, "for 40 years. The woman wept when she told me this dream, and I said to her, this is the work, to go through the empty house, to stop calling outward, to find the door at the end of the corridor, to kneel down before the part of yourself you abandoned long ago, and to say, I have come back, I am here, I will not leave you again. This is what silence makes possible. This is what self-focus, properly understood, actually means. It does not mean narcissism. It does not mean self-absorption. The narcissist is not focused on himself. He is focused on his reflection in the eyes of others, which is precisely the opposite. True self-focus is the willingness to turn away from the mirror and walk into the dark room where the true self has been waiting. It is the willingness to be unwitnessed. It is the willingness to do the work that no one will ever applaud because no one will ever see it. And yet, and this is the great paradox, it is precisely this unwitnessed work that begins to change everything. The witnessed world will see. The real turning point begins right here. Because when a man or a woman undertakes this descent, when they begin to integrate the shadow, when they begin to listen instead of speak, when they begin to contain instead of broadcast, something shifts in the architecture of their life. The right people begin to appear. The wrong people begin to fall away. Not through dramatic rupture, but through a quiet mutual recognition that the old contract has ended. Opportunities arrive that one had not even known to ask for. Old wounds, long thought permanent, begin to soften and release. It is as if the entire field of one's existence reorganizes itself around a new center of gravity, the self, which has finally been allowed to take its rightful place. The alchemists call this the konjunktio, the sacred marriage, the reunion of the conscious and the unconscious, the masculine and the feminine, the light and the dark, into a single indivisible whole. But do not mistake me. This is not magic. This is not the law of attraction repackaged in mythological language. This is something far older and far more demanding. The reason things fall into place when you focus on yourself and remain silent is not because the universe is rewarding you. It is because you have finally stopped sabotaging the order that was always trying to emerge. You have finally stopped, like a child shaking a snow globe, disturbing the very water in which the snow was trying to settle. The order was always there. The snow was always falling toward its rest. You were the one who would not let it. I have walked through my own underworld more times than I can count. There were years in my middle life when I descended so deeply into the unconscious that I feared I would not return. I spoke less in those years. I listened more. I wrote what arose in me without judging it. And I learned that the soul has a logic of its own, a logic older than the ego's plans, deeper than the world's demands. The soul knows where it is going. It has always known. Our task is not to direct it. Our task is to clear the path of all the noise we have piled upon it, and to walk. There is a Persian story I have always loved. A young man came to a Sufi master and asked, "How shall I find God?" The master answered, "By giving up everything." The young man, eager, said, "But I have already given up wealth, comfort, family, ambition. What else is there to give up?" The master smiled and said, "Give up your search." And the young man understood. To search for God outside oneself is to confess one has not yet found him inside. It is only when one stops searching, stops striving, stops broadcasting, when one sits in silence and turns inward and meets at last the divine pattern within, that the outer world begins to rearrange itself accordingly. Not because one has manifested it, but because one has finally stopped denying it. I want to say something now about loneliness, because I know this word frightens many of you. There is a difference, a vast difference, between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the painful absence of others. Solitude is the abundant presence of oneself. The man who has not yet met himself is lonely even in a crowd, because the one face he most needs to see is missing from the room. But the man who has descended into himself, who has sat with his shadow, who has danced with his anima, who has heard the voice of the wise old man within, this man is never lonely, even when he is alone. He carries an entire world inside him. He has become, in the truest sense, a self-sufficient cosmos, and from this fullness, not from emptiness, he meets others. He no longer needs them to complete him. He no longer drains them with his unmet hungers. And this, paradoxically, is when relationships at last become real, because two whole people can meet, two half people only collide. The shadow, I should say, is rarely what one expects it to be. People often imagine the shadow as the worst of themselves, the parts they are ashamed of. And yes, the shadow holds those parts, but the shadow also holds the unlived gold, the talents you never developed because your family disapproved, the dreams you abandoned to be practical, the passion you suppressed because it did not fit the persona you had constructed. This is why integrating the shadow is not merely about facing one's darkness. It is about reclaiming one's wholeness. It is about going down into the cellar of the psyche and finding that alongside the monsters, there is also a treasure chest sealed for decades, full of everything you were too afraid to become. You see, the soul does not speak in shouts. The soul speaks in whispers, in dreams, in the small ache that arises at 3 a.m, in the longing that surprises you at the most inconvenient times. To hear the soul, you must turn down the volume of everything else. You must become, for a time, useless to the world. You must let the phone go unanswered, the opinion go unspoken, the invitation go undelivered. You must become a closed vessel in which the fire can finally do its slow, sacred work. The world will not understand this. The world will think you have withdrawn, become strange, lost your way. But the world's understanding has never been the measure of a soul's journey. The world applauded the man who lived on its terms, and that man died unlived. The world will rarely applaud the man who lives on his own terms, but he will die fulfilled, which is the only measure that matters. There is something else I must tell you, and it is perhaps the heart of all I have said tonight. The reason silence is so powerful, the reason self-focus is so transformative, is that they return you to your own authority. Most of you have been living, without knowing it, under 1,000 small authorities. Your parents' expectations, your culture's measurements, your peer group's approval, the algorithms that decide what you see, the voices in your head that you have never paused to ask, whose voice is this really? Did I ever consent to this voice? When you fall silent, when you turn inward, you begin to separate the voices. You begin to distinguish the authentic from the inherited. You begin to discover what you actually think, what you actually feel, what you actually want, not what you are trained to think and feel and want. And this is the beginning of sovereignty. This is the beginning of becoming, in Jung's language, an individual, not a copy, not a member, not a function of the collective, but a singular, irreplaceable expression of the human spirit, The collective hates this, of course. The collective wants compliance, but the soul does not exist to comply. The soul exists to become. There are nights, even now in this late chapter of my life, when I sit by the fire and feel the old patterns rising, the urge to explain myself, the urge to be understood, the urge to fix what is not mine to fix. And I have learned after all these decades to simply place a hand on my own chest and say, not tonight, old friend. Tonight we will be silent. Tonight we will let the world be the world. Tonight we will trust that the river knows where it is going, and it always does. The river always knows. It is only we with our small frantic hands who keep trying to dig new channels for it. When we put our hands down, when we sit back on the bank, when we let the water flow, we discover that the channels it digs for itself are deeper and truer and lead to seas we had not even imagined. So I will leave you with this. The next time your life feels chaotic, your relationship strained, your purpose unclear, do not, I beg you, do not respond by doing more. Do not pile more action upon the unhealed wound. Sit down, close the door, turn off the noise, take a single sheet of paper and write down what you actually feel, not what you should feel, not what is acceptable to feel, but what is true. Sit with that truth, however uncomfortable. Walk with it, sleep with it, let it speak. You will be astonished at what arises when you finally stop drowning out your own voice with the world's. You will be astonished at the order that begins to emerge when you stop forcing one. You will be astonished at how much of your suffering was caused, not by what life was doing to you, but by your refusal to be still long enough to hear what life was trying to say. The unconscious is not your enemy. Silence is not your enemy. Your own depth is not your enemy. These are the great allies that the modern world has trained you to fear. Reclaim them. Descend into yourself the way the old mystics descended into their cells, the way the alchemists descended into their laboratories, the way Persephone descended into the underworld, not because she was defeated, but because she was becoming queen of a kingdom no one else could enter. There is a kingdom inside you, and you are its only possible ruler. But you must first stop trying to rule the outer world, which was never yours, in order to take your throne in the inner one, which always was. When you focus on yourself and stay silent, everything falls into place, not because the universe is performing magic on your behalf, but because you have finally stepped out of the way of the order that was always trying to find you. You have finally become quiet enough to be found. The lost parts of yourself can finally locate you in the dark. The right people can finally recognize the signal you have been broadcasting beneath all the noise. The life you are meant to live can finally take root in the soil you have at last stopped trampling. I will end where I began. There was a winter in my life when I stopped speaking, and in that winter, more was given to me than in all the loud years before it, not because I had earned it, but because I had finally, after a lifetime of striving, become still enough to receive it. The soul does not arrive in noise. The soul arrives in silence, and it has been waiting all this time in the quietest room of your house for you to walk down the long corridor, open the door, and say, I am here, I have come home, I will not leave again. So tonight, before you sleep, I want to ask you something. And I want you to answer it, not aloud, not to me, not even to yourself in words. I want you to answer it in the chamber beneath words, where the truth lives without needing to be spoken. When was the last time you were truly silent? Not the silence of avoidance, not the silence of exhaustion, but the silence of return. And what do you think has been waiting all this time for you to come back?